Happy Tuesday, everybody. We're getting into week 4 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and so we're starting to see some of the more late format strategies come around, and Orzhov, or White-Black, has definitely been the most amount of trophies that I've gotten recently in week 3. So I definitely think that there's a interesting space here, and I keep getting drawn into it. So welcome to episode 81 of No Rares Required, my weekly podcast or draft guide that dives into the limited strategies for a specific color pair or archetype. And this week, Orzhov Attrition won the vote. And I think Attrition is kind of, it fits. You can go a couple of different ways, right? I really think they could have called it Orzhov Sacrifice with a lot of the theme of the color of the archetype, but Attrition is kind of apt, right? You have a lot of really good removal in black-white, and so every week what I like to do is to start things off here with my draft skeleton, which consists of 17 commons, 5 uncommons, and 1 rare or mythic. And the reason why I do this is because if I can build a strategy that works at the common and uncommon level, then it kind of increases consistency and isn't dependent on opening up a very specific rare. So for those who are listening audio only, and I do have this on other podcast platforms, so thank you to those listening on Spotify and such. And the main takeaways, though, are focus on being mostly black, and this helps you get, cast your double pips off of Consuming Ashes and such. And then you kind of are just splashing white for, like, Holy Cow for a little bit of flyers, and then white removal. And, like, Mystical Tether, Lassoed by the Law, and Getaway Glamour. And then the Ruthless Lawbringer is pretty key to this archetype. Every time that I've trophied, I've had one, and I've ended up in black-white a couple of times without the Ruthless Lawbringer, and it feels bad. So really try to prioritize the Ruthless Lawbringer if you can, which is the Orzhov Signpost uncommon. And especially because you can put it in combination with cards like Fake Your Own Death and Mourner's Surprise that allow you to get multiple triggers off of the Enter the Battlefield, and cycle the Ruthless Lawbringer, get a lot of value off of that card specifically. And then you do also have a plenty of removal in black as well, so sometimes I have tried attempting this as a very controlling archetype with a lot of removal and low creature count, and I found that it usually likes to have a little bit more creatures than strictly like Dimir control. So generally finding myself in more of a mid-range space, if that helps. And you can also bring back some other interesting targets, not just the Ruthless Lawbringer, so cards like the Hollow Marauder that have a really good ETB, and even the Outlaw Medic that has the death trigger that when it dies draws a card, are both interesting for cycling through the Fake Your Own Death and Mourner's Surprise, which are pretty undervalued. So with that in mind, let's dive into the 17 lands data and cover which traps to avoid and when I think you should look to take each card. So if you're new here, the first thing that I like to do is look at the total wins created, and I calculate this by taking the average of game in played win rate and game in hand win rate on 17 lands, which have subtle differences, and then I subtract the average win rate of all users in the archetype and multiply it by the number of games played. And what this allows me to do is look at what cards are helping the most amount of people win. And so top of the list here we have the Ruthless Lawbringer, Vault Plunderer, Lassoed by the Law, Hollow Marauder, Mourner's Surprise, Desperate Bloodseeker, Outlaw Medic, Humiliate, Getaway Glamour, Consuming Ashes, Shepherd of the Clouds, Mystical Tether, Nezumi Linkbreaker, Prosperity Tycoon, Desert Stew, and Journey to Nowhere, which make up a good chunk of my draft skeleton. But we can repeat the same process here and instead do it for the total wins destroyed, so looking at the cards that are hurting the archetype for the most amount of people. And so our top 3 traps to avoid here are Black Snag Buzzard, which is the 2/1 flyer for 2 and a black. When it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on it if a creature died this turn. And really, and it has plot for 1 and a black. But the problem with it is that even if you're playing this as a plotted like 3/2 flyer or paying 3 for a 3/2 flyer, it trades against the Holy Cow, trades down because at least they get the scry and the life out of it. And the 2 toughness is really where I think this card falls apart. Now, to be fair, there is some of the decks are relatively weak against the flying strategy, which is kind of how I've been approaching Azorius, which we'll cover next tomorrow. And so it's, you know, again, these are cards that have misled a lot of people, but are not totally unplayable. If you're leaning very heavily into the flying strategy, which you can do in black-white, then it becomes a little bit more of a playable card. But the majority of people would do well to just avoid the Black Snag Buzzard. Similarly, the Boneyard Desecrator, this one was kind of like fits the theme of the Attrition or the Sacrifice. You get a 3/4 Menace for 3 and a black, and 1 and a black, you could sacrifice it to put a +1/+1 counter on it. And if an outlaw was sacrificed this way, create a treasure token. And the real problem with this is that you have better things that you can be doing, like sacrificing your 1/1 to the Ruthless Lawbringer, or even like the Unscrupulous Contractor to draw a card, you know, draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. That there's a real cost to even sacrificing the 1/1 tokens, and you know, a 4/5 Menace just isn't a high enough payoff for pushing damage in this set. It is at instant speed, so I had high hopes for this card, but it just hasn't performed very well. And it kind of, you know, especially the less powerful, expensive drops get answered by. There's a fair amount of removal in all of the colors in this set. So, and then Skullduggery is one, it's an instant that gives a creature +1/+0, and an opponent's creature gets -1/-1. And this one is better the more that you've got like the trained Arnixes and you're trying to do these little cheeky battles on the ground. And a lot of times I'm kind of controlling my opponent and then winning in the air in this archetype. And so the Skullduggery is less impressive if you're leaning more into invasion instead of trying to use it as a 1-cost removal combat trick that works some of the time. So, and you generally have better options to pick than the Skullduggery. So with the top 3 traps in mind, noticeably all 3 black, the next thing I like to do is I like to take those wins created and then divide them by the number of times that the card was picked. And what this allows me to do is kind of bring things down to a similar playing field, because your commons and your uncommons are going to have a lot more wins created because they're played more often than the rares. And so this kind of brings everything down to a more similar level. And then if I graph it against the average taken at, or ATA, I can then fit the data with a logarithmic regression. And this is a really nice way to figure out what decks are performing well, or sorry, what cards are performing well at what time point within the draft, and when to look to take certain cards. So by calculating the distance to the fitted line, which thanks to Carl, aka 2duck-cubed, we'll call value over replacement, and this allows me to see what the top cards are to look at different time points within the draft. And top of the list here for like what are my pack 1 pick ones that I'm really hoping to pick up. Number 1 is Hostile Investigator. You get a 4/3 for 3 and a black. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card, and then whenever a player discards 1 or more cards, you investigate. So it's a built-in 3-for-1. We saw this one in Golgari. It's really good in any of the attrition style strategies where you're trying to outvalue your opponent. Because if you're trading 1-for-1, Hostile Investigator gives you that 3-for-1 advantage by making them discard a card and by giving you something to draw. And then Overwhelming Forces has been particularly good in this archetype because you do have the ability to rebuild, and you are purposely kind of leaning into the reanimation strategy, maybe not so much as Golgari is, with some of the 5 and the 6 cost cards with like big beef, but you still have the Fake Your Own Death and Mourner's Surprise and things that you can utilize your graveyard and then go wide again after a Wrath. So unlike Golgari, which can struggle a little bit to rebuild after the Wrath, I think this one is kind of a natural home. And so Overwhelming Forces is the 8-cost Wrath that destroys all creatures that an opponent controls, so it doesn't even hit your own. And then you draw a card for each creature destroyed this way. Really great for that attrition strategy. And then the other one that is also an expensive Wrath is Final Showdown. Being able to tap for 6 to destroy all creatures, or 7 and keep one of yours indestructible. So since you're black, black and white both have a Wrath and are both good reasons to be in Orzhov. Next up, we go for the value over replacement for picks 2.5 through 5, and these are the ones that after your busted pack 1 pick ones, what are some of the other cards that will lead me into this archetype? And one of the early ones that I open up that I love to take early is Lassoed by the Law. Goes into every white archetype. You're going to be very happy with this one. It's removal that then also spawns a 1/1 mercenary creature token, and it can hit non-land permanents. And then you've got Hollow Marauder, which pretty much goes into every black archetype. And This one is, again, if you're doing the attrition thing, especially good, because the more that you're playing the value game, the more that you're going to advantage yourself off of the potential 3-for-1, where you make them discard and draw a card if they discard something that was less than mana value 4. So keep your eyes out for those built-in 3-for-1s, especially if you are in the controlling space. And then Shepherd of the Clouds has been another one that's very good in almost every white archetype. The Shepherd of the Clouds, 4/3 flying vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, return target permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand, and return that card to the battlefield instead if you control a mount. So you definitely want to keep your eyes out for the Shepherd. And then we have value over replacement for picks 5 through 8, and this is after you've kind of decided to be Orzhov. What are the cards that you're looking to solidify yourself in this archetype? And similar to what we've seen before in this set specifically, there are a lot of cards that are in the pick 5 to 8 range that are quite decent options, and but they're not going to differentiate you as they're not really. They're almost like filler. But this is really where, like, picks 5 through 8 is really, we're going to look to take a lot of your deserts if you're looking to enable your crimes. You're going to be looking for your undervalued uncommons and your commons, every once in a while a very undervalued rare. And once again, because it's too long to go through every single one of these individually, I'm just going to cover the top 3. And this is where you see your Ruthless Lawbringers. And part of the advantage to the white-black space is that Ruthless Lawbringer should be a pick 2.5 through 5. It should be one class up, and it's not. So Ruthless Lawbringer, being able to pick them up even after pick 5 is a real payoff. I think that people are starting to figure out Orzhov. I mean, Magic Numbers, the podcast by Sirkovitz that leans into 17 lands data, was talking about Orzhov as early as week 1. So we're starting to see it to be a little bit more drafted. And I've been in this the Orzhov space quite a bit. And Ruthless Lawbringer, like I mentioned, is a very key part of that, because not only is it a good card, being able to sacrifice one of your tokens to destroy a non-land permanent, so you can also destroy the enchantments that they have, your enemy white opponent has, but being able to trigger this again, right? Doing it multiple times is really what puts this over the top, and so you definitely want it if you can grab it. The Vanishing Verse is a undervalued rare with white and black, so kind of specific to the Orzhov space, and it allows you to instant speed exile target monocolored permanent. And there's enough big green beef that you definitely have good targets for this to land. And then we have Getaway Glamour. And so not only can you re-trigger your awesome ETB effect of the Ruthless Lawbringer, you can also destroy creatures that your opponents control that has greater power than your board. And your board tends to be relatively low power because you're kind of doing a lot of these small flyers, small creatures, and going wide. So unlike in some other archetypes where the Glamour, you'd have to flicker your own thing so that you don't have the highest creature power on the battlefield, Getaway Glamour works perfectly into the Orzhov strategy. And yeah, and basically can be a 2-for-1 if you have the Ruthless Lawbringer. And then for picks value over replacement, picks 8 and onward, this is really where you can kind of judge how overdrafted or underdrafted the archetype is. Generally, if you have somewhere between 3 to 5, it's in an okay spot. Under 3 is definitely overdrafted, and then over 5 tends to be a little bit on the underdrafted side. And so since we have over 10 options here in the picks 8 and onward, I'd say that the black-white space is still relatively underdrafted going into week 4 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and you should definitely check it out. And top of the list here, the card that I'm looking to wheel the most often is Humiliate. People don't really pick up this card unless they are in white-black. And so this one can be a good signal if it does wheel too, that you are in an uncontested space, because your other Orzhov player will probably grab it. Some people really don't like Humiliate. But being able to remove stuff in an attrition strategy is great, especially if you have early drops. And this archetype does have several 1-drops like the Nezumi Linkbreaker that you can make a perfect target for the +1/+1 on a turn 2 Humiliate. But then also this is 2 fodders in 1, so if you're looking to sacrifice something for the Ruthless Lawbringer, the Nezumi Linkbreaker is perfect. It also really works nicely with the Rooftop Assassin. The 1/1s in general, you can chump block something and then use the Ruthless Assassin to finish it off, and leaves you behind with a 2/2 lifelink flyer. So that's one that one of the synergies that I like to lean on in this space. And then last but not least, we have the Outlaw Medic. And this is another one, like I mentioned at the very beginning, is useful for looping multiple times from your graveyard with Fake Your Own Death, getting additional card draw. If you target it as the thing to sacrifice to Unscrupulous Agent, you can draw 3 cards. And so this one is a pretty good one to take advantage that people don't want it most of the time in white. So tomorrow I'll be covering the archetype with the second number of votes, which was Azorius, or white-blue. And these guides do take a fair amount of time to put together each week, and they are kind of a niche thing anyway. So please take the time to click like and subscribe, especially if you'd like to see these continued in the future. I do appreciate it. And I'll include the updated version of my draft guide in the description, so that if you want a updated list for each archetype, it is available to you. And then you can also join my Discord if you want to hit me up there, and you can always drop by on Twitch. I stream Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, and I host community drafts every Tuesday if you'd like to come draft and show off your draft prowess in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And special thanks to my YouTube members and Twitch subscribers and Patreons, all of those who choose to support me financially. Thank you very much, and thank you for helping my dream come true. And good luck, as always, with your games and future trophies, and I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of No Rares Required.